everything. Nice to have you all with me tonight, of course. And I am going to hit you all, just make sure we don't have any mysterious background noises during our presentation this evening. Nice to have some of my regulars back with me tonight. Hello to everybody. Just to introduce myself really quickly, my name is Alex Bean, if that helps you remember any better. I'm a big history nerd, got some of that out of my system getting my master's from the University of Chicago. I teach at the city colleges of Chicago, and I do a lot of the writing, blogging, and tour guiding, as I'm doing right now for Chicago Detours, which has been around for 10 years. Let me go ahead and start my share screen presentation here so you can see that more clearly. There we go. Celebrating our 10th anniversary, as I'm sure many of our regulars know at this point. We are looking forward to perhaps getting back onto the streets of Chicago, doing walking tours at some point in the near future. We think maybe sometime in July that might happen. But for right now, we're keeping up with our virtual tours. We're having a lot of fun covering as many topics in Chicago's history, architecture, and culture as we can. I know a lot of you have been following us in these nightly sessions, weekend sessions. You can follow us on social media as well if you care to keep up with us, because you've got plenty of fun stuff still coming at you. But for tonight, we are going to be talking about baseball in the great city of Chicago, and we are going to be talking about two moments in local baseball history that I regret to say for our diehard Cubs fans or White Sox fans might fill them with a little bit of pain and agony, but which are definitely among the great stories in Chicago sports history. And because these are crosstown rivals, we figured why not bundle these two stories together and make sure that both the North Side Cubbies and the South Side White Sox get their share of pain and redemption in one nice historic happy hour session here. I see Sandy saying in the group chat that she's Bridgeport gal. I presume a White Sox fan in that case. And Stephen saying Cubs fan who's so associated the lovable losers that he was beside himself when they finally won. In his cheering, he felt a piece of his identity being lost. And I certainly understand that, this idea that the Cubs couldn't win a championship it was very much part of being a fan of theirs. And we'll talk about that during our half hour here. So I'll go through the presentation I've created about the Black Sox scandal and the curse of the Billy Goat. We should have a couple of minutes set aside at the end of our time for any questions and answers. Honestly, my buddy Travis might be as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than I am on some of this stuff. He's been telling me all day about who should be in the Hall of Fame and the different stories I'm telling here. But let's go ahead, dive into some of the fun here. So we'll start on the South Side with the earlier story, the Black Sox scandal, which affected the White Sox, our baseball team on the South Side, back in 1919. Now, I want to point out the White Sox in the 1910s, especially the latter half of the 1910s, were one of the really great teams in the majors. They had won the World Series in 1917, if I'm recalling the year correctly, with basically the same set of players. They had changed managers, but the ownership had been the same. The players had been consistent. They were perennial contenders. And so they were always very much, at least in that day and age, a powerhouse in the American League. They were a team that expected to win the pennant, win the American League championship, and then go to the World Series and play for a championship. And they were a fantastic team in the summer of 1919, one of the great teams in the American League. And really, they were favorites all throughout that long summer for a championship at the year's end. And that was something that Chicago probably needed. 1919 was a very tumultuous year in the city of Chicago. There was a lot of chaos, probably most vividly remembered with the awful 1919 race riot, which broke out in the neighborhoods just around Comiskey Park in Bridgeport, Armour Square, Bronzeville, back of the yards. Dozens of people were killed in mob violence between white vigilantes and African Americans. It was a bloody summer. It was a very rough couple of years in Chicago as World War I ended and the economy was going through some changes. The demographics of Chicago are changing quite a bit as well. So having a great baseball team was something that people really appreciated. They loved that there was somebody they could cheer for in a neighborhood that had just seen a lot of very scary moments. So the White Sox are a team that Chicago was in love with in a lot of ways. They might not have loved all of the personalities associated with the White Sox, though, especially Charles Comiskey. He was the owner of the White Sox in 1919. He had been a player in the majors back in the 1880s, if I'm recalling correctly, eventually sticking with the sport and becoming the owner of the White Sox. He was, at least based on his reputation today, a little bit of a miser. He did not supposedly pay his players incredibly well. He would try to short them a lot. There was a famous incident in 1919 where one of the White Sox players was guaranteed a bonus. This is the legend, at least. Was guaranteed a bonus if he won 30 games in that season. Comiskey told the manager to pull that player from the rotation for the last 2 weeks of the regular season in order to save him for the World Series. There weren't playoffs actually at the time. He just won the pennant and then went straight to the World Series. But that meant that this guy couldn't win his 30th game, and that meant he didn't get his bonus, which, you know, that's a good way to kind of get on the bad side of your players. And it is worth noting that the White Sox were a very talented team of players, but they didn't necessarily get along with one another. The clubhouse was split basically right down the middle between working class guys who had grown up playing baseball, probably in the fields or the streets of the towns that they lived in, and just kind of got so good that they, you know, made it to the majors. And there was another group in the clubhouse who were college boys. They had become excellent athletes at the schools, mainly on the East Coast at that time, and had stuck with baseball as something that paid, but also not something that their whole life depended on it necessarily. They were college educated. They had brighter futures perhaps than the others. This was a stark cultural divide for the 1919 White Sox, and that kind of sets the stage between Charles Comiskey being a little bit of a hard case here, and the cultural divide in the clubhouse sets the White Sox up for a cheating scandal. So these two players right here, Chuck Gandil on the left and Eddie Cicotte, if I'm recalling how to pronounce his name correctly, they were the ringleaders of the conspiracy to take money from gamblers and gangsters and throw the World Series in 1919, lose it on purpose. And I want to point out for a quick second here, this was certainly scandalous, but it was not unheard of for there to be collusion, sometimes even collusion, between baseball players and bettors back in the early 20th century. Major League Baseball fairly aware of it. Club owners knew about the gambling that was going on. Players would lose games on purpose and to pay off from gangsters, from bettors, and it was all fairly out in the open. Travis was Cicotte. Travis was correcting my pronunciation, Eddie Cicotte there. Travis was also telling me that this was something that was kind of openly joked about at baseball games. Instead of singing "I'm forever blowing bubbles," they would say "I'm forever throwing ball games." Everybody knew that the fix was in, but nobody had been caught necessarily, or at least nobody had been caught in a really grand spectacle. And the games that had been thrown were not the World Series, the championship of Major League Baseball in the United States. So that sets up the scandal in 1919. These two guys are the fellows who bribe the White Sox players. Sullivan, who is a bookie from Boston, and Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish gangster from New York. They're the ones who kind of put the pieces into motion. And this is something that's been controversial. There's been sort of a historical revision here. If you go back to the classic book about the 1919 scandal, 8 Men Out, the story was that the gangsters approached the players with this offer for payoffs. Essentially, they lost the World Series on purpose. They would make as much money in a week as they would in a regular annual salary. And it is worth noting, professional baseball players back then did not make the millions and millions that baseball players make today. They certainly were better paid than working class people in the stockyards a couple of blocks away, but it was not, the salaries were not stratospheric in the way they are these days. So this was a deep temptation. There has been some recent research that says just the opposite is true. The players reached out to the gangsters and not vice versa. This will be contended for a long time, I'm sure, but especially because the White Sox best pitcher, who was not in on the conspiracy, was ill during the World Series, these players took money from the gangsters and lost on purpose. The White Sox were heavily favored in the World Series. They were playing the Cincinnati Reds, who, were pretty good. I know Travis is a Reds fan. I'm sure he thinks they earned this World Series victory. But the White Sox were heavily favored. They had won very recently. They were considered the better team, and yet they fell behind early in the series and wind up losing in the end. And I did actually want to point out, I had not known this until I was just making sure I had all my ends straight. The World Series in 1919 was a best-of-9 series, not best-of-7. I just hadn't realized that. But the Reds do eventually win, I believe, in Game 8 of the World Series. And the White Sox, who had been heavy favorites, lose, which means that the people who had bet against them get a windfall from betting against the favorites. This is something that people openly suspected at the time. There had been a run on bets for the Reds right before the World Series started. So players were talking about it, writers were talking about it, even fans were talking about it. Supposedly Charles Comiskey was informed that the fix was in after game one, but did nothing about it. He just wanted this problem to go away and not be talked about. But the rumors about the White Sox losing on purpose in order to get a payoff circulate for about a year. And in 1920, this case eventually blows wide open, and the players who had taken payoffs from the gangsters are eventually put on trial for fraud here in Chicago in 1921. If I'm recalling correctly, the actual claim in this case was that the players would get paid a bonus if they won the World Series. There was a different amount of money between appearing in the World Series but losing and appearing and winning the World Series. So the fraud was that these guys had lost on purpose and cost their teammates the extra money that they would have made from winning the World Series, as people thought they were supposed to. So that was the fraud that was committed here. Now, obviously, that trial was just sort of the legal case that could be presented. This was a much bigger public scandal because it seemed to affect the moral righteousness of baseball. And like I said, cheating had been rampant, apparently, in baseball in the early 20th century. Ty Cobb, maybe the most famous player of that era, had supposedly been fixing games back in the 1910s. But nobody had been caught. Nobody had been caught, at least in the World Series. And so this was something that required baseball to be cleaned up. So even though these players were put on trial, they were actually found not guilty. The evidence, at least, wasn't strong enough for a legal guilty plea to be considered, and yet they were kicked out of baseball. Now, the most controversial participant here was Shoeless Joe Jackson. These days, he's probably best remembered for being, a pivotal character in Field of Dreams and a major part of the 8 Men Out movie that was also made in the 1980s. A lot of baseball dad movies from that time. But he was a very acclaimed player, and he supposedly had not been part of the planning of throwing the World Series. He hadn't gone to any of the meetings, but he was aware of the conspiracy and didn't alert anybody. And so he was included in the trial and in the eventual expulsion from Major League Baseball. After this scandal, the National League and the American League hire a former federal judge, Judge Landis, who you see on the right, to be the first commissioner of all baseball. He's in charge of decisions about who gets to play and who doesn't. He bans the 8 Black Sox players, as they come to be known, I'm sure you understand the color inversion there, from participation in professional baseball. Some of them tried to perform in what you would now call like the minor leagues or in pro-am competitions, that sort of thing. But the major leagues, and especially Judge Landis, made clear that if you hired these men to play baseball for crowds, you would also be blackballed from professional baseball for the rest of your career. So all 8 of these guys, the 8 men who were thrown out of baseball, suffered this public stigma, even though their trial had found them not guilty. The most controversial, like I said, was Shoeless Joe Jackson. He was a great player, supposedly was aware of the conspiracy, but didn't mean to participate. He actually played very well throughout the World Series, but that wasn't enough to save his hide. All of these players were banned from baseball. All of them have been kept out of the Hall of Fame since their careers ended in the early 1920s. Travis saying here, most of the Reds players and owners contended to their dying day that they would have won the series had it been fair, which he says maybe not so much. It doesn't necessarily, they still have the title. They've got the championship, but it definitely does add a cloud of controversy there. Now, this would hang over the White Sox for a very long time. Like I said, they were a fantastic team through the 1910s, but they don't even become a contender again for decades. It would take until 1959 for the White Sox to win the AL pennant and go to the World Series once again. That's a way to 40 years. And they lost that series to the Los Angeles Dodgers. So it took them another 46 years to finally win the World Series in 2005. Ending one of the longest dry spells in professional baseball. They waited over 85 years between their last World Series, between 1919 and their eventual championship when they swept the Houston Astros in 2005. Yes, the Go-Go Sox, who, definitely were the Cinderella story of the year, especially coming right after the Red Sox had broken their long curse in 2004. It just felt like all of these old hexes were being smashed into pieces especially by Red Sox to White Sox. It was a really neat sequence there. So they eventually broke the curse of the Black Sox, overcame that scandal that stigmatized the team for such a long time. I did also want to note, one of my favorite anecdotes here is that Charles Comiskey wanted to be a member of the Chicago Athletic Association, a very famous fancy downtown private club. He got denied membership to that club because his players had cheated. They said, how could we admit a member to this club who had allowed cheating to go on under his nose? It kept him from being with a who's who, including, notably, the Wrigley family, who owned the Cubs on the north side of Chicago. The other thing I always love mentioning, when the White Sox won the AL pennant in 1959, the fire chief of Chicago, who was from Bridgeport, he was an ally of Mayor Daley, he sounded the emergency alert alarm all across the city to celebrate the White Sox winning the pennant and going to the World Series. This is at the height of the Cold War. There was no warning given, so if you were not listening to the game on the radio and didn't know that the Sox had won the series, people freaked out and thought they were about to die in an atomic holocaust because this idiot used the emergency alert alarm just to celebrate a White Sox victory, which I read that Mike Royko's boss and found it to be deeply hilarious. All right. So we've got our other great baseball story to talk about here, the curse of the Billy Goat. And this is one that I actually have a great time talking about on one of the walking tours. We probably won't get to offer this one for a while yet, but this is a story that I share on our historic Chicago walking bar tour, which is a really fun walk around the Magnificent Mile area that we get to do in ordinary time, we might say. Mark saying that the alarm scared the heck out of him as a little boy in Logan Square back in 1959. I am sure it terrified a lot of people from what I understand. All right. So the curse of the Billy Goat goes back to 1945. The Cubs, our baseball team on the north side of town, had a storied early history. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Cubs were a powerhouse, just like the White Sox were in the 1910s. But they hadn't won a World Series championship since 1908. So that is a pretty pronounced dry spell there. 1908 to 1945 is a heck of a long time, I think it's fair to say, to not win a championship. And this is something that has been grating on baseball fans, especially baseball fans on the north side of the city, who've been waiting for a chance to celebrate their hometown heroes. Now, that jumps us to 1945. The Chicago Cubs are playing the Detroit Tigers in the World Series in 1945, and a local tavern owner, you see on the left here, William Billy Goat Cianis, buys 2 tickets for a World Series game at Wrigley Field. One for himself and one for his goat, Murphy, who you see in the photographs right here. The story behind this is that Billy Goat's Tavern was on West Madison Street, out near the old Chicago Stadium where the United Center is located today. One day, a livestock truck drove down Madison Street, probably heading towards the meatpacking district around Fulton Market. A baby goat fell off the rear end of the vehicle. That goat picks itself up, walks itself straight into Bill's Tavern, and just acts like it owns the place. Bill loves this. He gives it a patch of grass behind the building, nurses it back to health, turns it into basically a staff member, a mascot for the whole club. And by the time you get to the 1940s, this initial incident with the goat happened in the late 1930s. By the mid-40s, he has supposedly not just his original goat, but a whole menagerie of goats. Apparently, as his fame and infamy grew, anytime the Chicago police found a stray goat within city limits, they would send it to Bill's Tavern, figuring he should have a right of first refusal. So he's taking the goat to City Hall. He's taking the goat to Blackhawks games. He's even taking the goat to Cubs games. I was actually in the Billy Goat Tavern with Sam Cianis, his nephew, the current owner, about a year and a half ago. And Sam was telling me that that same summer in 1945, Bill had taken Murphy to a Cubs game and just sat in the bleachers. Nobody bothered him at all. So he thinks nothing of this. He wants to root for his home team. So he buys two tickets to the World Series in 1945, shows up the goat, and the staff doesn't let him take the goat inside the facility. He appeals this decision to P.K. Wrigley, the owner of the Cubs, essentially saying along the lines of, Mr. Wrigley, you know me, I know you, you've had beer in my tavern. I think you've met this goat before, and we just want to root for the home team. And so, you ought to honor the purchase here. Wrigley says, all of that is true, and I look forward to my next visit at the tavern. And Bill, you're always welcome to cheer for the Cubs, but the goat cannot come inside the ballpark because it stinks. Bill is incensed by the story and says something along the lines of, them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more because they ain't letting my goat inside of the ballpark. Now, at the time, this is just a funny little story, the kind of thing that pops up as a minor report in the newspaper. But the Cubs do go ahead and lose the 1945 World Series to the Detroit Tigers. So Bill sends a telegram to P.K. Wrigley that says simply, who stinks now? It's a pretty good burn for a telegram, I think it's fair to say. Now, this is funny, very clever of Cianis here, but it's also a turning point in Cubs history. Up until 1945, they've been a good team that just couldn't get over the hump and win a World Series. But after 1945, they become bad. They become the lovable losers, as we were talking about in the chat there, and they become perhaps the worst team in the National League throughout the rest of the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s. And so sports writers, including Mike Royko, who I mentioned earlier, and fans start pointing to this incident in 1945 and saying, aha, I know what happened. Back in 1945, the Cubs were cursed by Bill Cianis. This is the curse of the Billy Goat. Now, in reality, bad management, bad ownership, bad players. These are the sorts of things that actually cause curses. But there are moments of seemingly cosmic bad luck that people could point to as evidence for a curse. One of the most infamous moments happened in 1969. The Cubs had been the best team in the National League all summer long. They're playing in September. I believe they have a 14-game lead on the New York Mets in September 1969, but they're playing in Shea Stadium that month, and Ron Santo, one of their best players, is on deck waiting for his chance to bat, and in the middle of the ballpark, surrounded by countless people, a black cat walks right across the field and goes in between Ron Santo in the batter's circle and the rest of the players in the dugout. You can see them kind of grinning at this cat as it walks past in the photograph right here. But this was a bad omen, if ever a bad omen has been seen. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the Cubs start losing after this black cat incident. And on the final day of the regular season, the Mets beat the Cubs for the National League pennant, go ahead and win the World Series just a couple of years after the club had even been organized. So it's an event like that. We've already been waiting since 1908 for a championship. It's been since 1945 that you've even had the hint of a winning season, the hint of the potential for championships. And so people start going crazy. By the 1970s, there was an event outside of Wrigley Field on opening day called the Feast of the Goat. People would whole roast a goat on a spit outside of Wrigley Field before the first pitch was thrown for the season. Everybody would eat a bite of it and then carry the goat into the ballpark in their stomachs. Which is, that's some dedication, I think it's fair to say. There's also there's rumors that people would like catapult goat corpses over the outfield wall in the middle of the night. I know the Harry Carey statue had a goat head hung from it at one point, about 10 years ago, if I'm recalling correctly. So this is a long-standing desire to break the curse. And so the Cubs finally break, I should say. In 1984, they finally get back to the playoffs, 39 years after that 45 loss. And so they invite Sam Cianis, the current owner of the ballpark and the nephew of Bill Cianis, who had brought the goat to the game back in 1945. He brings a goat to the first playoff games at Wrigley Field in nearly 4 decades, and true to form, the Cubs win both of the games that the goat attends at Wrigley Field on the north side. But this is a best-of-5 contest, and the other 3 games are played on the West Coast in San Diego. Nobody invites Sam or the goat out to sunny Southern California. The Padres win games 3, 4, 5. Go back to the World Series and play the Detroit Tigers, those foes from 1945. So the curse lingers, and somehow its worst moment is still to come. My apologies to any Cubs fans who are still suffering from this. 2003, the Cubs were closer than ever. They're in the National League Championship Series against the Florida Marlins. They are up in the bottom of the 8th inning. There's a fly ball into deep left field. As it reaches to the fence, a Cubs player named Moises Malou jumps up to try and grab it as it goes over the line. A couple of Cubs fans, most notably the young man in the turtleneck and the Cubs hat here, a kid named Steve Bartman, reach at the ball as it gets there. Nobody catches it, neither the fans nor the player, but that snaps a chance for the Cubs to get out of the 8th inning and only have 3 more outs between them and the World Series. And this visibly affects the players on the field. Moises Malou, if I'm recalling, screams at Steve Bartman up in the stands, and there's a ripple of unease that circles Wrigley Field. People remember their history. They know the curse, and this feels like a moment where the curse has come to bear. Bartman starts getting pelted with things. from people in the upper deck of the stadium. He had to be escorted out of the ballpark by security and eventually left Chicago. He moved away and has never come back, supposedly, because he received so much abuse from the Cubs fans at Wrigley Field back in 2003. Unsurprisingly, the Cubs players do not recover from this moment, this missed opportunity. They let the Marlins back into the game, and the Marlins wind up winning in the ninth and hammering the Cubs in Game 7 the next night before going ahead and winning their second World Series in 6 years back in 2003. So this curse at this point has lasted over 70 years until, you may recall, November of 2016, in the 10th inning, after nearly blowing it in the bottom of the ninth, the most terrifying inning of baseball I've ever watched, after crawling back from a 3-1 series deficit, the Cubs amazingly, miraculously won their first World Series championship since 1908, defeating the Cleveland Indians and bringing the World Series championship back to the north side of Chicago. I will admit, I love these stories. I'm not even that much of a baseball fan, but this was the most incredible moment in sports I can recall in the past couple of years. My wife was 8 months pregnant. I fell over on her feet when they recorded that final out. I was so stunned by what had happened. And I live about a mile from the ballpark. I tried to walk up to see the crowd outside of Wrigley Field. I couldn't get within about 2 blocks. The entirety of Wrigleyville had become a mosh pit. People were so excited. And I've always loved the anecdotes of how the celebration lasted. In my opinion, all of the north side smelled like beer for about a week after the Cubs won the World Series back in 2016. The victory parade in downtown a couple of days later had over 1 million spectators. And no, is it 1 million? I forget how many it was. It was an absolutely astonishing crowd at that World Series victory parade. And I've always loved as well, the next summer in 2017, there was a baby boom on the north side of Chicago. Supposed 5 million people. Thank you, Travis. Supposedly, a lot of those kids born in mid to late 2017 were nicknamed Clark or Addison, which is the intersection that Wrigley Field is located on the north side of Chicago here. So both of these curses are broken, but both of them definitely haunted the people of Chicago for a very long time. And they are fun stories, even if, you know, we would prefer for our teams to win championships every single year. Cynthia saying they have friends with cats and dogs named Hobby too. That's fantastic. I love that sort of thing. So that brings us to the end of our time together here. Thank you for joining me this evening. Of course, we appreciate your tuning in. We appreciate your support. Donations are what lets us keep doing this. Your $200 to $200 donation allows us to keep offering these free virtual tours like this one. We have a lot of fun being able to do that, but you know, we still got to keep the engines running here a little bit. So happy to share that with all of you. And I wanted to mention we got other fun stuff coming up soon. This is the schedule for our upcoming happy hours and virtual tours. We've got, I was mentioning before the presentation started, my coworker Ellen is going to be talking about the hidden architecture of Fulton Market in the West Loop tomorrow. I actually just found out today I am going to be leading the Cruise from Your Couch virtual boat tour for Father's Day on Sunday. So if you want to see me again, 1 p.m. on Sunday, we'll be going up and down the Chicago River. We've got some fun stuff coming up. We've been trying to theme the different days of the week. So we certainly do hope you can rejoin us for some of these events sometime soon. Well, I also wanted to mention, if you have already made a donation, want to support us in some other way, a review on a site like TripAdvisor, Google, Facebook, they're highly appreciated. They let the world know that we are out there and really let us continue to have this sort of fun. So all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop share at this point, jump back into our sort of conversation bubble right here. I saw a couple of people saying, leaving comments here, did want to ask any questions for me as we wrap things up here at the end of our half hour together. I got light hitting my face kind of strangely here. Any questions for me? Robert, I was scrolling back through the chat. I saw Robert was saying Bartman worked for Hewitt Associates. He had protection until he left town. I do actually really love it. It was very classy of the Cubs organization. They gave Steve Bartman a World Series championship ring after they won the title in 2016. It was the same sort of championship ring that all the players got, which was very classy of them. I hope Bartman was happy to have gotten it. He didn't accept it in person. He's made it clear that he doesn't think emotionally, psychologically, he can go back to Wrigley Field, but it was a very nice gesture by the Cubs organization to send that championship ring to him. Couple of other questions right here. Yes, I am one of those who hopes that baseball returns in a safe and healthy manner sometime later on the summer. It seems like maybe we're starting to see agreement getting reached between the players and the owners here. I'm hoping so. Travis was saying the Black Sox might have had the nickname before the scandal in 1919. The rumors are that the Comiskey made the players pay for their own laundry instead of providing it. So the players went on a laundry strike and their uniforms were filthy, which that sounds like Charles Comiskey. Of everything I know about Charles Comiskey, not paying for the team's laundry sounds like exactly the sort of stunt he would have pulled back in the early 20th century. Travis, as you can see, is a baseball savant here. Amy was asking where he gets his info or recommends a good book. He has many baseball books. He's loaned several of them to me, and it took me years to read them, but I did get them done eventually, a half-decade later. But I'm sure he has a couple of comments he can leave for you right here. I'm sure would have been able to lead this talk in his sleep, while walking backwards. But yeah, 8 Men Out, excellent for the White Sox history there, the Black Sox scandal. Excellent movie adaptation of that too. Tom Verducci, Travis said, has a good book about the latest Cubs series win, and there's been tons of writing about both of those teams over the past 100 years or so. Bonnie asked, are Billy Goats still at the tavern? Not as a regular appearance. Like I said, we visit the Billy Goat Tavern in downtown during our usual historic Chicago walking bar tour. They don't have Billy Goats down there very often. That would be a little bit of a code violation. But they do bring them back in for special events. I know they closed for renovations a couple of years ago, and they had the goat there when they reopened after actually making a bathroom that was suitable to the 21st century. And I think they also tend to have the goat around on like St. Patrick's Day, other big drinking events in downtown Chicago. They're a very popular spot for those sorts of events as well, of course. Travis recommended Boys of Summer about the Brooklyn Dodgers of the 50s. That is a very good book. I read that a couple of years ago. But yeah, I think that just about does it for our time. Thank you all for joining me this evening. I hope you had a good time. Hope Travis was able to help fill you in on all of our baseball details here. Happy to have you with me this evening, and have a great evening, everybody. Cheers, and thanks for being with us once again. Night, everyone.